I was walking home one night last year. My neighborhood isn't particularly well lit, but there is a single street light on the dirt road. That night, as I approached it on my way home, I saw another figure coming my way. As we got closer, I saw it was a homeless man. In the dark, I could see he was short, had a large backpack, and was wearing what looked like a filthy poncho. As we passed each other, he looked at me and stopped. "Peter," the man gasped. I thought I heard fear in his voice. I'm Hispanic, short and stocky, about 5'4", and I have a beard. Basically, I look like a construction worker. He probably should have called me Pedro. "No," I said as I continued walking. "Not Peter." As I started to pass him, though, he shot out a dark, hairy arm. "No," he said after a moment. "You're not. Your voice is different. But you seem to me the exact likeness of Peter. Here, let me look at you." And before I could say anything, he stepped into the light. At first, I thought he was Hispanic like me, but when I saw his distinguished nose and thick brow, I realized that he was Middle Eastern. He was about 2 or 3 inches shorter than me, which is saying something, and he was thin. His long, woolly hair was filthy and looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks, and his beard was stringy and patchy. But it was his complexion that impressed me, because it was immensely dark. I don't mean that he had skin like a black person, but there was a pallor of sickliness that made his skin look far darker, deader than it naturally should have. "You are not the exact likeness I thought," the man said to me after a few moments. "Your nose is thinner, and your eyes. You do not have the light behind them that Peter had." "Good to know," I said politely. I didn't want to talk to him anymore, so I started to leave. "Wait," the man said, grabbing my arm. "Please, tarry with me for a few minutes. If you do, I promise you money." I'd never heard a homeless person offer money, and he didn't talk like a homeless person. He had an accent, and his manner of speech seemed either educated or old-fashioned. I could have probably overpowered him if necessary, too. I was intrigued, so I agreed. I got comfortable, leaning against the streetlight, and we talked for a few minutes about the weather and other mundane things. "Are you a religious man?" he asked after a bit. "I grew up Catholic," I said, "but I believe in rational thought and reality." The man laughed, but it was mirthless. "You say rational thought and reality as if they're the same," he said. "But it has been my experience that reality seldom cares what a man thinks is rational." "Is that so?" I said. "A man's reasoning is only as good as his vision," he continued. "What he has seen, where he is standing, and where he decides to keep his eyes. I guess. I'll prove it to you," he said. "Young man, would you like to know my name?" "Sure," I shrugged. The man smiled, showing broken teeth. "I am the one known today as Judas Iscariot," he said, "who walked with Jesus Christ in Galilee." And here we go, I thought. "Is that right?" I smiled. "You don't believe me, of course," he said. "Nope," I said curtly. "Judas died when he hung himself and his bowels fell out." "Yes, I hanged myself. But," and now he spoke in a softer voice, "by that time, I had lost the privilege of death." The man was too well spoken to be your garden variety crazy homeless person, and there was intelligence in his eyes. He was clearly messing with me. My natural argumentativeness came out. "But," I said, "Judas was buried in, what's it called?" "The Potter's Field," he finished. "Or Field of Blood. Yes, they buried me there, but I was not dead when they did it. See for yourself." He lifted up his poncho, and I reeled back. To my absolute horror, the man had no abdomen. Right below his ribcage was a cavity, a thin layer of heavily scarred skin, which I assumed had once covered his entrails, stretched so far back that it reached the outline of his spine, which I could have reached out and touched. Where there should have been a stomach, intestines, and all those things necessary for being alive, There was only space. As I looked up to meet the man's eyes, though they weren't there, because his head now swung at an angle upon his chest, his neck broken, I jumped back. The man laughed, fixing his head with a sickening crack. "Don't feel too bad," he said. "Reason is crucial, but it's only as good as what reality has chanced to show you." For a few moments I couldn't speak. This man should have been dead, but here he was, standing and talking with me. How are you? Did you make a deal with the devil?" I blurted. I wasn't used to thinking metaphysically, and it was the only thing that came to mind. He chuckled softly. "No, I already told you that I lost the privilege to die. Some people think I made a covenant with Satan before everything happened. I did not, but you do not need to. He can destroy you just the same if you're not careful." "Is that what happened when you betrayed?" I stopped myself. It seemed rude. The man looked at the ground. "I lost track of where I was keeping my eyes," said the man sadly. For the first time, I felt pity for him. He talked for a good half an hour, and I listened. He described his old home, his family, and the other disciples. Whenever it felt that he should have mentioned Christ, however, his story became suddenly vague, and he left out lots of details. He clearly didn't want to talk about it. After a while, I realized that the man only ever described events in terms of before and after. It was easy to guess what frame of reference he was using. I can't relate everything he said here, but it was a lot. "Are you the only one?" I asked when he was finished. "An ancient person that's still around?" "Very few do something to deserve this," he said. "But there is at least one more that still walks the earth. He's the one that has come to be known as Cain." The man shuddered. "I do not wish to meet him again. Cain made dark covenants, and he has the same anger and hatred as his master. But Cain is mightier." "Cain is mightier than Satan?" I said. "Really?" "Do not be impressed," he cautioned. "Anybody that has a body is mightier than the old serpent, but not smarter. He can lead you to your destruction as easily as a lamb to a butcher. I've only ever met one man who is smarter than Satan, and I was his disciple." The man looked like he was going to say more, but he seemed to stop himself. "I've got another question," I said. "You said you lost the privilege to die. How is dying a privilege?" The man chuckled again. "Oh, how many things have been lost," he said. "Without death you are damned, for when your time on this earth is over, death is a gate to progress, to the final glory. Damned, another word for stopped or unable to progress." "Progress to the final glory? You mean to heaven?" Again, he chuckled. "Heaven is not the final glory, at least if you do things right." "There's something better than being in heaven?" "Yes," he said. "Take a guess." After a few moments, I had to admit I was stumped. I couldn't think of anything better than heaven. The man smiled again. "The final glory," he said, "is godhood." It took me a moment to process what he said. "So, you're saying that it is possible to become a god, like our God?" "Yes." After a moment of being stunned, my mind was flooded with questions. "Will we all become gods?" I asked. "I doubt it," the man said. "Everyone on earth has the capacity, but do not suppose for an instant that God will bestow ultimate knowledge and power to children that have proved they won't be good. Could you imagine omnipotence and omniscience given to people that haven't developed temperance, love, and justice? The world would be chaos." "So, if we become gods," I reasoned, "is that how?" "Yes, very good. That is how God became God. Once in another world, he was a man just like you, son to his own father. He lived righteously, died, was resurrected, and was bestowed with godhood." "This seems too much," I said. "Oh?" the man said. "Think, man. What is the purpose of our coming to this earth? Do you suppose there simply wasn't enough room in heaven? We came down to prove ourselves worthy of godhood. For who would act badly in front of God, save Satan and his followers? And tell me, why do you suppose there is pain and evil in this world if God really is both all-loving and all-powerful? Well, how can you prove yourself worthy if there is nothing to prove yourself against? I was silent for a few moments. That still leaves me with some very serious questions, I said. Unfortunately, I cannot be the man to tell you more, he said, and he picked up his backpack from the ground. In fact, I have left out the most crucial parts. I have lost all rights to actual ministry, and I have probably said more than I should have. You will have to search for the answers to those questions by yourself. But I promise that if you search well, and here he smiled sadly, showing his broken teeth, you will find the answers. That's not fair, I said. I desperately wanted to know more. Perhaps you're right, he said, putting on his backpack. Maybe I should have not said so much. After all, why would you trust that man who betrayed Jesus Christ? I thought about that, but there had been something in the way that he had spoken, something about his absolute plainness, and the way his dark eyes had, for a brief moment, shimmered. I did not feel that he was lying. I promised you money, he said, extending his hand to me. Take this. He handed me what appeared to be a quarter. I've been trying to pay for my actions for almost 2,000 years, he said. Maybe our conversation will be a stone removed from my dam. I don't deserve forgiveness, of course. But then again, nobody actually does. And yet, he gives it anyway. I looked briefly down at the coin he had given me. When I looked up again, however, the man had disappeared completely. I was now all alone under the streetlight. I examined the coin more closely and gasped. It wasn't a quarter. I later showed the coin to my friends and family, though. Nobody would believe my story. It was a single piece of silver. For days after my encounter, my head spun with questions. I wanted to see Judas again. The things we talked about had made me feel a sort of hunger in my soul, and I wanted more. So I started volunteering at a homeless shelter, hoping he would show up. He was homeless after all, wasn't he? I spent every free moment at the local soup kitchen. I cleaned the dishes in kitchen, I prepared the food, I served it to the people there, all the time keeping my eyes peeled for a short, dark man with messy hair, broken teeth, and a dirty poncho. But he didn't show up. By the third week, I started losing hope of seeing Judas again. By the fourth week, I'd given up hope entirely, but I wasn't thinking about that. You see, I had forgotten my reason for volunteering and was simply enjoying the work. At first, I hadn't even paid attention to the people I was serving food to. I was just too busy looking over their shoulders, trying to catch a glimpse of a filthy poncho. But as I had lost hope of seeing Judas, I started paying attention to the people in front of me. I started watching them, and I started talking with them. There was two serving Stephen, a man with thick glasses who constantly tried to get more food than the other people. He always talked about Watergate with me, and when there was enough food to spare and no one else around to care, I would sneak him an extra orange or pudding. Then there was Katie, a 30-something suffering from drug addiction that hadn't seen her kids in 2 years. We talked a lot. And Fat Juan, I'm not being rude, it's what he called himself. He was the jolliest man you'd ever want to meet, constantly flashing toothless grins, and his gut was so enormous that it hung literally 10 inches over his belt, and of course, his pants never stayed all the way up. As I spent time with them, I grew to love these people. Sometimes I would feel reluctant about going to the kitchen. I might feel that I'd rather read or watch movies or something, but not once did I regret it after I got there. One late afternoon, I was the last one at the shelter. I had my own keys by that time, and it was my turn to lock up. I was sweeping up in the kitchen when I heard the front door open. "I'm sorry, we're closed," I called out. After a moment, however, a person entered the kitchen. It was Judas. I dropped the broom and immediately hugged him. I don't know if it was appropriate, but I was happy to see him, and he smiled. I offered him a bagged sandwich from the counter, but he held up his hand. I don't have the stomach for it, he smiled, glancing towards his abdomen. And then I remembered, the man had no organs south of his sternum. I was an idiot. I had been searching in a soup kitchen for a man that didn't have a stomach. Welp. We pulled up 2 chairs in the main room. Judas looked exactly the same he had as before, though his hair might have been even a bit dirtier. I saw you come in here earlier, he said. Can I guess you were looking for me? I confirmed his suspicion. We made small talk for a few minutes, and I helped myself to the sandwich. He asked how I had been, and I told him about the last few weeks. I have so many questions for you, I said after finishing the sandwich. I'm sorry, he shook his head, but I can't be the one to tell you the most important things. You said that last time, I said. I don't understand why. Because I no longer have that right, Judas replied. When it comes to the most precious truths, the deliverer has to have the authority to deliver them. I wanted to press him, but there was a finality in his voice that told me he would not budge. You should be easier on yourself, I said after a moment. I beg your pardon? I did some reading, I explained, about Christ's death. He had to die. Yes, said Judas. He was looking at me quizzically. So you should be easier on yourself, I said. It all had to happen like that. Suddenly the man's brow grew furrowed. It did not have to happen like that, he said, slamming his fist on his leg. I was taken aback, but he continued. Of course there were other ways. Do you suppose I was foreordained to sin? No, light does not mingle with darkness. Or do you suppose that I was a puppet of fate, robbed of my will? No, I was tempted by Satan, and I heeded. But there were prophecies, I started. Prophecies? Do you know what prophecies are? They are knowledge of truth and nothing more. They exist because of our actions, not the other way around. I had sons, and I knew them. I knew what things would cause them to stumble. But was it my knowledge of my sons that caused them to stumble? No. Do you suppose that God's knowledge of our weaknesses dooms us? No. They are our weaknesses, and ours alone, and it's a devil that tries to tell you otherwise. For a few moments, we sat in silence. I'm sorry, I said quietly. He looked at me, and his dark eyes were calm again. No, he said, putting his hand to his forehead. I am sorry, friend. You meant well, and I should not have raised my voice. But true change means not excusing your sins in the least, and resisting all urges to do so. So I humbly ask you, please, do not give me opportunities to excuse my sin. I do not need them. He put his hand gently on my shoulder. I agreed. He called me a devil once, Judas said, looking at the ground. And it was true, I was. Well, he called Peter Satan once, I offered. I remember that occasion, he said. Tell me, do you know what the word Satan means? I admitted I didn't. It means adversary. When Peter tried to persuade Christ, even in goodwill, that he did not have to take the very difficult path that he was born for, Peter momentarily made himself Christ's adversary, and Christ did not need that temptation. Oh, right, I said. Satan isn't the devil's real name, it was Lucifer. I now realize I wasn't staying on subject, but Judas was kind. Wrong again, my dear friend, Judas smiled. Lucifer is another title, it means bearer of light. And so he was, just as many who bear truth. Light may be Lucifer's, but he changed that when he started the war in heaven. A war in heaven? It was a schism, he said, between those who chose to pursue godhood in the way that Father had outlined, and the angry ones that wanted to achieve godhood on their own terms, which is actually impossible. But anger seldom cares about what is possible. They knew what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The war ultimately divided the ones who got bodies from the ones who decided to separate themselves from the light." He looked solemn. "Separation from light is death of the spirit," he said softly. "Your spirit still exists, of course, but there is no joy. There is no real happiness, only lies, anger, and suffering." "I wonder what it would have been like to be there during the war," I said. Judas chuckled. "You were there. Before you were born here, you had another name. You lived there for what would measure as thousands of years, though I'm not sure we measured it the same there. Everybody that has come to Earth, and everybody that will, lived in heaven and was present for the war. And since you have a body, you can know which side you chose." We spoke for a little while longer, mostly within that vein. Eventually, however, the light in the windows grew dark, and we knew the sun was setting. Judas said he had already spent enough time, and that he had to go. We locked up the soup kitchen, I hugged him outside the door, and we parted ways. I only lived about a half a mile from the soup kitchen, so I walked home. When I wanted to get there quickly, I would cut through the woods behind my apartment building, and so it was that night. The sun was still setting, and there was just enough light to make my way through the trees. I was probably about 100 yards from my apartment when I saw a light. It started from behind me. I only noticed it when my shadow grew long. I turned and saw what I can only describe as a ball of light, growing and growing in brightness. After a few moments, I realized that there was a figure within the light. It was an angel. He had flowing white hair that reached to his shoulders. His fancy white robe had the most intricate otherworldly designs, and the sash around his waist had what appeared to be a type of writing, which I didn't know the meaning of. The angel called me by my name. "Rejoice," the angel smiled. "You have been chosen to receive great truths." It took me a moment to process what he was saying, but as soon as I did, I felt excitement up and down my spine. "I'm listening," I said. The angel smiled again. "I come bearing knowledge that will set you free, and with this freedom, you can find happiness, and you should share this knowledge with everyone you know, so that they may be free also." "And what knowledge is that?" That... "Wait," came a voice. I turned my head. A small figure came out from behind the tree, and I saw that it was Judas. "Come here, Judas," I said excitedly. "Come talk with us." "Get thee hence, Satan," said Judas to the angel. "Do not heed this sinner," said the angel to me, rolling his eyes. "He would lead you into false service, but rejoice, for you may lift up your head and be free." "Get thee hence, Satan," Judas repeated. The angel turned to Judas. "And by what authority do you command me?" the angel said. I almost thought I heard the hint of a sneer. Judas paused for a second. He looked unsure. Then he said something. He said it so softly, almost under his breath, that I did not hear it. Suddenly my ears were filled with a terrible scream. I had to cover my ears. I thought my eardrums would burst. The trees seemed to shake as if we were in a tornado, and suddenly, all around me was darkness, spreading out like a mist. The cry grew even louder, and the angel no longer looked angelic. His face was contorted as he wailed, and his eyes seemed as black holes, until the darkness completely overtook my vision. I was knocked to my knees. I thought the darkness would consume me. Then in an instant, it all ended, and the angel was gone. After a moment I realized I was on my back, and I felt immensely weak. I could see the calm night sky above me. Soon Judas leaned over me. "What'd you do?" I managed to ask. "Something I perhaps did not have the authority to do, but it is done." He extended his hand and helped me up. "I had a feeling I needed to follow you. Now I know why. Satan can turn himself into an angel of light, a shadow of his former self, if not more ornate." "Didn't know that," was all I could mutter. "If you see an angel again," said Judas, putting my arm over his shoulder, "tell them to shake your hand. A true angel is either a resurrected being, so you'll feel their hand, Or they're awaiting resurrection and don't have a body, so they won't try to shake your hand. But Satan and his followers, they just can't resist trying to deceive. If you go to shake the angel's hand and you feel nothing, then you know it's the adversary. Here, let's get you home. He promised me freedom, I said as Judas helped me walk. That's what he promises everybody, said Judas. It's his favorite irony. We walked in silence for several minutes. Eventually, we reached my apartment where Judas propped me up as I unlocked the front door. He hates you, you know, he said. Since you're trying to find truth, were it in his power, he would destroy you, body and soul, until nothing of you remained. That's terrifying to know, I said, opening the door. Judas chuckled. It means you're on the right path. I bid Judas good night for the second time. I will probably see you again, said Judas. But in the meantime, be wary. I fear there is more yet to come. And he left. I saw Judas about 2 weeks later. We walked in the forest behind my apartment, and he answered questions I asked him, at least the ones he agreed to answer. After a while, we eventually reached a small lake where my friends and I occasionally went fishing. I used to be the best at skipping stones, he said, looking out across the lake. We spent a good 15 minutes skipping rocks. It didn't take Judas long to warm up, because, before long, the stones he threw would regularly get 6, 7, and even 8 skips across the lake's surface. Can I say something? I asked after he had managed to get a stone almost completely to the other side of the lake. Sure, he said. I've been thinking, I said. I know you don't make excuses for yourself, but I think you have to forgive yourself. I don't think that's the same as excusing yourself. I mean, how can you become a new person if you don't let the old one go? For a moment, Judas looked surprised, but then he creased his eyebrows and shrugged. Perhaps you're right, he said. Could you do that? I asked. I could try, he said, looking at the trees. For a while, we didn't talk. I think there's something else you need, I added after a few minutes. And what is that, my friend? A shower, man. You smell horrible. We walked back to my apartment, and I let Judas use my bathroom. Of course, he knew how to use a shower. He'd been around long enough, and I provided him with a pair of grooming scissors before shutting him in. Even though he was shorter and thinner than me, we were similar enough in clothes size, so while he showered, I replaced his filthy clothes with a nice white t-shirt I had recently bought and a pair of comfortable, broken-in jeans. I took away his ragged tennis shoes and replaced them with a pair of my durable boots, which would definitely last longer, and for good measure, I found him a hat. Judas exited the shower, dressed himself, and went back to the bathroom to groom himself. When he came out, his beard was neat, and his hair was shorter and cleaner. He still had the pallor of someone who had been homeless for a very long time, of course, but regardless, he still looked much better. I even offered him a new poncho, a gift from my grandmother a few years ago. I'm Mexican, remember? Thank you, he said after looking at himself in the mirror. I don't even recognize myself. It's all good, I said. You can repay me by answering some more questions I have. Fair enough, he said. I asked if we could go for another walk through the forest, and Judas agreed. There was something about being out in nature that made our conversations feel sublime, somehow more real. It started to get dark about 10 minutes after we entered through the forest. Judas was in the middle of answering one of my questions, when suddenly he reached out an arm and stopped me. Something isn't right, he said, looking around. What's the matter? I asked. Darkness. It's almost night, I said. No, this isn't what I... But he stopped. He was now looking into the forest, and I looked where his eyes were drawn. It was a man, a humongous one. The man was completely naked, though I couldn't tell at first. He was covered entirely in thick, curly body hair. Were it any thicker, he might have literally looked like a bear. He was easily 6.5 feet tall. I've seen taller men, but never a bigger or stronger one. His muscles were like boulders, not like a bodybuilder whose muscles are mostly for show, but immensely thick and sinewy, and even his thighs were bigger than a man's head. He looked like, given enough time, he could literally rip one of the trees out of the ground with his bare arms. The unkempt hair atop his head was thick, black, and curly, and must have reached halfway down his chest. "Cain," said Judas. I felt the blood drain from my face. The man slowly grinned. His great teeth were like a row of gray tombstones, and even from the distance, he smelled horrible, like rotting flesh. "What do you want with me?" Judas called. "I'm not here for you," Cain said. Then he looked at me and grinned even wider. If I had any blood left in my face, it drained out too. "He looks like Peter," said Cain. What do you want with me?" I demanded. "Satan knows you know too much," Judas said quietly to me. "He doesn't want you sharing anything with lots of people that could shake his kingdom." The man's ears must have been astute as a dog's because he laughed. "He said I would find him with the traitor," said Cain. "The angels don't usually let me near people, but there are never any guarding you." Judas's face grew long. "You should have never been around me," he said to me quietly. "This is my fault." Cain took a step toward us, and I'm surprised the forest floor didn't shake. "You will not destroy this man," Judas said, extending his hand. "Not at first," smiled Cain, licking his lips. And with what seemed to be only 2 or 3 steps, Cain was right before us. Judas, however, stepped in between the lumbering figure and me. "Move," Cain grunted. "No," said Judas defiantly. Cain towered over Judas. "Very well," said Cain. "Shall I kiss your cheek before I destroy you?" "You can't kill me," said Judas. "That doesn't matter," smiled Cain, and he put his humongous hand on Judas's shoulder. For a second it seemed like time was frozen, but the spell was broken as Cain's thick brow furrowed and his dark eyes suddenly had an evil gleam. "Run!" Judas yelled. I did what he said. From what I can tell, Cain must have flung Judas to one side, because I heard the collision of a body with the forest floor, and before I knew it, Cain was after me. I am short and stocky, and definitely not a runner, but I sprinted with everything that was in me. Darting in between trees, I could hear Cain's taunting, booming voice, and I cannot, in good conscience, repeat the things that he said he would do to my body, before, during, and after he killed me. I can, however, confirm that his horrible promises were not limited to just devouring my flesh. And he was gaining on me. Suddenly Cain gave a shout, and I heard an immense crash. I risked a glance behind me. Cain had fallen face forward, but his head. There was a stone still spinning on the ground. Almost 15 yards behind Cain's immense, prone figure, I could see Judas, his arm still outstretched. "Head for civilization," Judas yelled. It took me a moment to find my bearings, but as I hurriedly glanced through the trees, I was able to glimpse the mountains, east. I had to head west for a few hundred yards, and I would reach a road. How far until I could reach a gas station or house or something? Who knew? Would that actually stop Cain? Who knew? But I ran. Now you might consider hunting to be more of a white person thing, but I can tell you that my family has done it frequently, which is how I know what I ran into when I was running recklessly and not watching, and why my foot instantly became tangled and I fell. It was a net trap. They're usually meant to get deer, and I'm not even sure they're completely legal, but there was one, and my foot was tangled in one. It would have been easy enough to get out of if I had a few moments, but I looked up, and there was Cain. "I have caught you," he said, and he approached. Maybe Cain had set the trap, I don't know. All I know was that in that moment, I realized the irony that, in my entire pursuit of truth, I had never once prayed. Now seemed like a good time to start. but Cain was approaching too fast, and my brain was too frozen to even form words in my mind. With a shout, I saw a figure throw itself onto Cain, and I recognized it as Judas. At first, it didn't seem that Cain even minded. He was a mountain, and Judas was a breeze. However, Judas swung his arm towards Cain's face. Cain bellowed, and immediately threw Judas off of him. Cain began clutching his eye. As Judas got up, I could see that he was holding a jagged stone, and that it was covered in black liquid. What blood must have turned into after pumping through the same veins for thousands of years. As quick as he could, Judas put himself between me, the idiot tangled up on the forest floor, and Cain. Still clutching his eye, Cain made to grab Judas, but Judas's hand was too quick, and he fended Cain off with the stone, delivering a few cuts to the giant's arm. Cain didn't seem to mind the wounds, but he couldn't manage to grab Judas. His sudden lack of depth perception was probably not helping. Finally, Cain stood up properly. He sighed and delivered an earth-shattering punch to Judas's face. Judas was knocked down to the ground with more than just the force of gravity. He fell before me in a heap, and for a moment he stayed down. "Will you not yield now, traitor?" Cain bellowed. Slowly, Judas stirred and began to rise. I looked into his eyes as he began to get up. Cain must have hooked Judas in the left cheek because Judas's jaw now hung completely askew on the right side of his face. But this didn't stop Judas. Slowly but shakily, he rose to his feet and stood defiantly before Cain, a thin, 5-foot-tall man against a giant monster. Cain lowered his hand from his eye. A black goo was streaming down his face. His remaining eye glared at Judas, and with one swift motion he delivered a punch that could have stopped a semi-truck directly into Judas's chest. Judas was knocked back against me, and he didn't move. Cain laughed. "You do not need to be dead for destruction," he cackled, and he looked at me and laughed even harder. He began approaching me. Suddenly, an amazing light began to grow in between Cain and me. The light from Satan's visitation had been immensely bright, like someone had shone a spotlight into my eyes. This light, though, it was different. I struggled to describe it, but this light almost seemed tangible, like I could have reached out and felt it between my fingers. I would have not been surprised if this was an angel. And sure enough, after a moment, an angel appeared. This one looked much different than Satan had. While Satan's robes had been intricate and covered in ornate designs, this one's white robes were simple. "Get thee hence, Cain," said the angel in a booming voice, "and never return to molest this man." I was surprised when Cain immediately fled, and as I watched him disappear into the darkness, I had to wonder what the angels did when Cain attempted to refuse their orders. In a few seconds, Cain was nowhere to be seen. Then I looked down at Judas, who I held in my arms. In movies, people always get to cradle the dying person in their arms, maybe exchange some heartfelt dialogue. I didn't get that. As soon as I looked, I instantly knew that Judas was no longer there. It was just his body. His chest was completely caved in, and his white t-shirt now had a scarlet flower of blood that reached almost to his back. "Do not fear," the angel said to me. "You will not see Cain again as long as you are righteous." "Shake my hand," I said, stretching out my arm. I had not forgotten Satan's attempt to cheat me, nor Judas's subsequent advice. The angel reached out and shook my hand, and I felt his strong grip. "You weren't watching Judas," I said shakily. "Of course we were," he said. "All penitent souls are watched after, but we were ordered to allow this." "Why?" I demanded. "Because," smiled the angel, "it is finally time for Judas to rest and progress." My natural argumentativeness almost came out, but in an instant, any sort of anger or resentment was gone. "He has a wife and children who have been waiting very patiently on the other side to see him again," the angel continued, "and some other friends who will welcome back with open arms. They've had some time to forgive him." "But why?" Why like this? I asked. Judas betrayed a man that was willing to lay his life down for his friends, said the angel. But now Judas has laid down his life for his friend. I can promise you, Judas would have refused it any other way. I laughed a little. I had to agree with that. Lay Judas's body to rest here in the forest, the angel commanded. Use the shovel and blanket in the back of your truck and bury it out by the lake. And the angel began to fade away. Wait, I said. I still have questions. Seek, and you shall find, the angel said. Soon the light was gone, and I was left alone in the forest with the remains of my friend. And so I buried his body by the lake. I marked it with a humongous stone, and I said a few words after. I don't know if Judas was listening. I wouldn't be mad if he wasn't, since he was probably too busy on the other side. I still visit the stone sometimes when I have questions, and I look over the lake and skip a few stones.